Good evening. My name's Rebecca Salter and I'm President of the Royal Academy. And thank you all for joining us this evening for the Genesis conversation, Risks, Rewards and Exhibition Curation today. This conversation will be an opportunity to explore the considerations today for curators and institutions in planning their exhibition programmes. We're very fortunate to welcome this evening's esteemed panel and chair, who will share their vast and rich experience and their insights into the future. This evening will be chaired by Samira Ahmed. Samira is an award-winning journalist and broadcaster who regularly presents the BBC's arts show Front Row and editorial programme Newswatch. She was previously a news anchor and correspondent for Channel 4 News and BBC News, and her many documentaries explore the intersection of popular culture, science, politics, and social change. Samira will be joined by Simon Wallis, the newly arrived Secretary and Chief Executive of the Royal Academy, Daniel Slater, Director of Exhibitions at the V&A, Yesomi Umolu, Founder and Director of YUCA Cultural Consultancy, and Clarrie Wallis, no relation, Director of Turner Contemporary Margate. For those who may not be familiar with Genesis Conversations, this is a series of free discussions from the Genesis Foundation, bringing together cultural and future leaders to discuss key issues affecting today's cultural world. Previously, the conversations have been hosted in partnership with arts institutions such as the Almeida Theatre, the National Theatre, and the Barbican. Through long-term partnerships with leading arts organisations, the Genesis Foundation nurtures creativity and innovation by commissioning new works, funding training and mentorship, and opening doors to protect professional opportunities. In September 2023, the Royal Academy of Arts embarked on one such partnership as we welcomed two individuals to our Collections and Exhibitions Department, proudly named the Genesis Future Curators. It has been this unique placement that has provided opportunities for both the individuals and the RA to learn and benefit from these impactful entry-level roles that are otherwise difficult for young people to access. It has been a true joy to welcome these colleagues through the support of the Genesis Foundation and to see them develop and grow their skills and experience and know they are now well positioned to go on to great things in the museum and gallery world. This week marks the end of the inaugural placements for the Royal Academy's Genesis Future Curators. In April 2023, we saw hundreds of applicants apply for these two roles, which revealed how in demand and rare these opportunities are. Natasha Fife and Gabriel Yamroz have been exemplary candidates who have flourished and become key members in our exhibitions and collections teams. And it's bittersweet to say goodbye to them. We're immensely proud of what they've achieved, and I have particularly enjoyed watching you develop through our regular catch-ups. And we're incredibly grateful to the Genesis Foundation that we will be continuing this programme for another 2 years from this autumn. I would now like to ask you to join me in welcoming John Sudinsky, founder and chairman of the Genesis Foundation, to congratulate our 2025 Genesis Future Curators. Would you like to come up? To return to tonight's event, thank you for joining us, and I'm delighted to hand over to Samira and this evening's panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome to this very timely conversation about the state of exhibitions and museums. We have curators and museum professionals with huge experience on the panel, and we'll have plenty of time to take your questions too, so think what you might like to ask. 5 years after COVID, with rising costs, growing social tension and political instability around culture, it seems to me the perfect time to assess the subject and the changes we've seen to the art of putting on art exhibitions, from the offbeat to the blockbuster, from the big city institution to the smaller regional museum. We'll look at the balance of commercial priorities and risk-taking, at what works, what doesn't, and how audiences are responding. And although we had the panel introduce it beautifully, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them. So starting with Simon Wallis, who is the new Secretary and Chief Executive of the RA. He was previously founding director of the Hepworth Wakefield, and during his 17 years there, devised the exhibitions and learning programme and led the team who won the Art Fund Museum of the Year. Next to him is Clarrie Wallis, Director of Turner Contemporary Margate, where she leads on the gallery's vision, programme and public engagement. And previously, Clarrie spent, 21 years at Tate, and is also the author of a number of books on contemporary art. Daniel Slater has been Director of Exhibitions at the V&A since April 2019. Prior to his current role at the V&A, which of course recently opened the amazing Storehouse East and the David Bowie Archive, he's worked at Tate, the British Museum and White Cube. And our fourth panellist is Yesomi Umolu, the founder and director of the YUCA Cultural Consultancy, but also recently served as Director of Curatorial Affairs and Public Practice at Serpentine, and was the Artistic Director of the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. And her previous curatorial roles include positions at the University of Chicago and Tate Modern. So you have a wonderful range of experience and an international perspective. I wanted to start by asking each of you if there's an exhibition or two that you have worked on or curated that you feel is a significant one for you, maybe marked a big breakthrough moment. Do you want to go first, Simon?
I've got so many to reflect back on, given I started my career in the mid-90s at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge and loved working with the collection there as I did at Tate Liverpool. But I think actually the exhibitions that sort of defined something that was so exciting for me were Anthea Hamilton's first public show at Chisenhale Gallery when I was director there in 2008, and so exciting to work with a young artist at a pivotal moment and then to watch what they went to go on and build in their career. A wonderful artist, and so exciting to see how that talent can be developed and nurtured.
Excellent. You answered the question I didn't ask, which I wanted you to answer, which is why this exhibition and what was special about it. So thank you. And now, Clarrie, same question to you.
I think the most significant show that I've worked on was working with Steve McQueen when we realised Year 3 at Tate Britain. And for those of you that don't know about it, it was a very ambitious invitation to all school children that were in Year 3, so 7 and 8-year-olds, to have their portrait taken. So it was a portrait of London and it was a portrait of potential. So it was always going to be very charged in terms of actually understanding at this pivotal moment in time difference and about the sense about possibility and how do people then get to where we get to in their life, which is something that Steve feels so acutely. The show actually opened 4 months before COVID hit, and whilst we kept the exhibition on and then kind of reopened it, I think just in terms of it, the significance of it as a project and what it actually said about London and what it said about art and about children coming to art galleries and accessibility, it became even more poignant. So I think that's probably the most important show I've done.
Wonderful. Daniel?
I should plug a show that I'm curating next year, which is on contemporary Asia-Pacific art happening at the V&A. But, and as important as that is, I think the most important show to have worked on is the Bowie show that we did in 2013.
The David Bowie.
The David Bowie is, exactly. And one of the reasons you've already mentioned of why that's so significant is that making an exhibition isn't just about that physical thing that you do at that particular moment in time and people coming to see it, but the legacy of that has resulted in the nation acquiring the whole of the Bowie archive, 80,000 pieces, which become one of the most significant resources in terms of performance research that exists. So that, alongside taking a public figure, a popular culture figure, and putting him in a museum context, and taking someone who is themselves compulsively creative, but then also looking at the circle around them and putting that into a V&A context, into kind of what was a stuffy institution. That was actually a game-changing moment for the V&A, and that's why it was important.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that a little later. Somi?
Yeah, because I'm last, I'm going to go for two, if possible, but there's a connection between them. The first will be, I curated Jana Comfort's first solo exhibition in a US museum in a very small college town in Michigan that seemingly had no relationship to this pioneer of the Black Arts movement. And what was significant in terms of that show for me, obviously, was bringing a hero of mine to a new US audience, but to try and galvanize interest in this context. And then the next one would be my curation of the Barbara Chase Riboud retrospective at the Serpentine, another amazing pioneer, and an exhibition that really revealed the magnificence of the practice for a really global audience. So I would bookend those two things in terms of, regardless of whether or not you have a context that is very well knowledgeable about contemporary art, or one that's new to contemporary art, there is possibility to kind of introduce new perspectives and narratives to them.
Yeah. I wanted to ask each of you as well for a sense of where your institutions are now 5 years after COVID, because there wasn't just the impact of people not being able to go to see exhibitions. There was also the reality of a kind of backlog of exhibitions that might have been about to open or in progress. And I wondered how each of you were impacted by this. You want to go first, Clarrie?
We're actually online. I'm on target in as much as I didn't inherit a lot of forward program. In fact, I had to move quite quickly. So we haven't sort of found that kind of sense of kind of scheduling or not being able to bring in programs. So I've been running the program at Turner for 2 years. So no, we've been fine with that. If anything, it was more like the opposite, where actually things had been left. We needed to move fast.
Yeah. What about for you, Daniel?
We did do a small number of cancellations, but I think we were, when the pandemic started, we took a much more sort of this is going to be awful view than a lot of institutions did. And the plans that we made, pushed things much further into the future, but also I think something that was really important that we did at that point in time, when things started to come back online, we knew audiences were going to be slow, that there was all the capacity issues, that sort of thing. So we started running our shows for a much longer period.
Interesting.
That's obviously it's more of a pattern for us now. And I think there's an assumption that when you're borrowing the types of materials that we're borrowing, it's impossible to have these long runs. But with the right investment going into it in terms of the relationships that are required to borrow these things, you can get them. And what that's also meant is that we're not moving huge numbers of artworks all over the world at huge carbon cost, at huge financial cost, for runs that are going to be quite limited. And that means our exhibitions are on for longer. They can return not just more financially for the institution, but they can be there more for the public. And in the end, that's why we're putting these things on.
Yeah. Somi, what have you noticed about the impact of COVID?
So I returned to the UK in 2021 and took over the curatorial team at the Serpentine, and that was right in the midst of a lockdown. And we had to do a lot of work between January 21 to the summer, which I think there was a sort of social distancing and things were starting to open up to catch up. And because Serpentine was is a very artist-led organization, we felt a huge level of responsibility to stick to our commitments to artists and to try and adapt our schedule moving forward to that, which meant that, we had to do some things really quickly. We had to delay a few things, but the idea was to kind of keep the commitment to the artists consistent in spite of the uncertainty.
What about for you, Simon, at Hepworth?
Well, good. I can talk about the Hepworth because I can't talk so about the RA having been here for only 3.5 weeks. But at the Hepworth, we were lucky, of course, to have a collection that was growing consistently. So there was always that resource to draw upon no matter what. And we did have to push exhibitions forward a little bit, but I think it was a chance to rethink how we were going to engage audiences that had obviously been absent for so long and came with a very different set of expectations. I think a lot of people getting in touch with their creativity. By the way, I can hear this.
Yeah, it's cutting out, isn't it? We might need to use yet another handheld. Okay.
Yeah.
Use that one in the meantime and we'll swap them around. Thank you.
We'll see. Is that better? Can you all hear me? Great. Yeah, it was really an opportunity to slow down, exactly as everybody else was saying, this kind of hysterical almost level of program changes that we were going through when we initially opened, calming right down and actually having a hybrid of a collection and temporary exhibitions to work with was a real boon for us, because it meant there was a rather different set of experiences we could offer audiences as they were beginning to return. But I think, everybody's getting back into their stride now, but some audience behaviours have definitely changed for good.
Explain that, because that's going to be my next question. So why don't you start, Simon? How have audiences changed, and how is it affecting how you think about what exhibitions you might curate and put on?
Well, I mean, I do think a greater understanding of who the audience is and how you're going to communicate with them and make sure that you get them to come to, be it an organisation like this or indeed the Hepworth Wakefield, finding something that is absolutely going to chime with a broad audience. Obviously, we need the numbers coming through. All of us need numbers coming through our institutions, no matter what. But that richness of experience and getting people to slow down in general, I think, is a really, really important aspect of what our organisations do. People wanting that sense of, I felt when I was up in Yorkshire, people desperate for that community again, the connection that you get with experiencing works of art in a space together. We really found people thirsting for meaningful experiences they've been cut off from for quite a long time. And it was a wonderful thing to kind of build on. People getting in touch with their own creativity, but also this sense of the art gallery being this social space that felt more valued than ever.
So, well, speaking of an art gallery as a social space, I was thinking of Serpentine and, particularly the Summer Pavilion, where in the last few years I've really noticed a sense of thinking about the audience coming in and having events, almost theatrical events. Tell me a bit about your thinking about audiences there and elsewhere.
Well, maybe something to say about the pavilion, and I'm sure all institutions face this, was that there was a proliferation of engagement online. And somewhere like the Serpentine was able to easily pivot its program to online programming for that audience. And actually, after a couple of years of that happening, we see actually there has been a balance between the in-person audience and an online audience. So then now there's this need to really think about what does that engagement look like if you're not there in person. But in relation to the pavilion, I worked on quite a few of them. I worked on the Samira Valley one, which was very fascinating actually, because we had to think about how this pavilion might work in social distancing, but also as a fully occupied structure. And as part of that, we decided to integrate a sound commission to give the possibility that if people were socially distant and there was less of a engagement with other people, that the space will feel full in some ways. I worked on Theaster Gates, which had a very strong through line of programming through the course of the summer. Which
that bell, didn't he,
yeah,
that you
exactly.
rang, yeah.
And I worked on Mass Studies, the one most recently. I think what the Serpentine Pavilion shows, it's sort of like an event that happens every summer in London, and it's not just the kind of building that happens, but it is the sort of social moments that are possible. And we, at Serpentine, we took advantage of that opportunity to kind of create and cultivate the various communities that could gather around the pavilions.
Clarrie, how have you noticed audiences changing?
I think it's interesting because I was still at Tate during COVID, so I moved to Turner Contemporary in 2022. But I think at Tate we really had that sense of actually feeling incredibly valued, or really understanding the importance of the museum and that sort of sense of actual community. And I think with them moving to Margate, we are really at the heart of the local community, and you really feel that very, very strongly. So there's a sense in terms of thinking very deeply and very carefully about what that actually means in terms of the type of programme you're delivering.
Because you're an anchor in Margate. I mean, you've brought in a whole new economy of... whenever I've gone, you meet tour groups who've come from miles away just because they've heard of Turner Contemporary and they want to see it and they want to come to Margate for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know, I mean, Turner was, really quite extraordinary and very ambitious project in terms of building an art gallery in an incredibly deprived, very struggling seaside town. I mean, even today, there are huge levels of social deprivation. So behind all the glamour of Margate being incredibly cool, we have very, very high youth unemployment. We've got very high proportion of young children living in absolute poverty. So it's complicated, and we recognise very much the civil responsibility that we have in terms of how we're serving our community. And we are there very much to attract tourism and, really help feed the town. And what's been amazing about it is it has been this phenomenal success. We have put over 100 million back into the local economy. Our visitor figures this year will be 390,000, but it's fragile. And at the end of the day, we are a local art gallery, so there's that sense about how you're really serving your local community. And so we're trying to make sure that our learning programme, which is incredibly expensive, how we're working with local partners, all of that is very much rooted in the belief and the commitment we have in terms of social justice and keeping the gallery free and making it accessible to everyone.
Daniel, the V&A has been on such an interesting journey, and the nature of the exhibitions, particularly the blockbuster fashion and style exhibitions, seem to be at the heart of engaging with a big, maybe slightly different audience. I don't know. Tell me a bit about the picture for audiences now.
I mean, the fashion is obviously a huge part of our programme, and rightfully so, given the collection that we have, the national collection of dress and textiles. It is an opportunity for us to bring into the museum a huge, very engaged audience who is incredibly loyal, and for us to, work with some of the most creative houses that have been in existence basically from the 19th century to the present. It is a balance that has to be struck, with a huge amount of sort of sensitivity and thought, to not be seen or feel ourselves that we are simply a sort of rotating place for fashion houses to advertise themselves.
Yeah, well, how do you find that balance?
The easiest way of explaining it is that there is genuinely no amount of money that would ever make us take a curatorial decision about what to program if we didn't want to do it. And there are, it's not necessarily a daily thing, but it's certainly weekly, where there might be someone who feels that they are an equivalent of a Bowie, or a house that feels they're an equivalent of a Chanel or a Dior or a Schiaparelli, who, I speak to. And they're ready. But if we are not ourselves wanting to make that happen, it just doesn't go anywhere. So we obviously rely on everyone here, generosity from outside of our institutions, and generosity that is not coming from government. Even those of us who get huge amounts of grant and aid, we still need more to do the shows that we want to make for the public and that the public expect of us. But they don't happen unless we feel it's right for the institution, it's right about what we want to say about the institution, and also it's right for the public. So it's very easy. There's no amount of money that has ever pushed us to do something that we didn't energetically want to do. But when we want to do something and there's funding, we would be silly to not jump at that.
Right. I wonder what the rest of you think about the impact of, I suppose the David Bowie exhibition back in 2015 was a big landmark, and it seems like it's had an effect on other museums thinking about blockbuster shows. Is it something you're aware of? Has it had an impact on the thinking of institutions you've been working at? Do you want to take that one first, Clarrie?
I think my time at Tate I was working with some really quite exceptional curators, and now Catherine Wood, who is Director of Exhibitions at Tate Modern, and I think that there was that sort of sense of kind of broadening out in terms of the type of programme that was appropriate for a museum, for an art gallery. So I think that thinking around bringing in fashion and performance, and you think, for example, of Lee Bowery, that's fairly recently closed at Tate Modern. So I think I would say that the V&A show was the beginning of that kind of shift.
In a lot of 80s fashion related, there was the face at the National Portrait Gallery as well.
Quite a lot. But I think that sort of sense about, in terms of broadening out of audiences, and I think this more interdisciplinary approach, it certainly, was something that my time at Tate we were kind of aware of, and fellow curators were very much involved in kind of shifting the dial in that direction.
Yeah. What about you, Simon?
Well, I think back to the show that J.W. Anderson curated for us at the Hepworth. It was amazing. I learned so much about... Thank you, Clarrie. You say all the right things. I learned, and audiences learned so much about the connection between fashion and creating dresses and creating sculptures. There were amazing dialogues going on, and it did help build a brand new audience for us. It definitely brought in people that hitherto had not been to the museum and gallery before, but it was wonderful to find a sincere way of building relationships and connections. It came out of Jonathan's passion for British modernist art, so it wasn't some cooked up thing. It had absolute sincerity at its core, yet at the same time drew really interesting parallels between the creativity found in fashion and what he was seeing echoed in many of these British modernist artists, which were at the core of our collection. So I think it's really interesting finding ways in which those interdisciplinary moments can be fruitfully reflected. But I think what audiences are so sensitive to is whether it's done with sincerity or not. It really matters that the connections and the relationships are deep, rather than, you know, looking perhaps on occasion, as some of these shows can do, perhaps a little cynical. But I think
you're not going to name a show, are you?
Oh, I'm most certainly not.
Okay,
no.
I thought I'd just give it a go. Somi, what are your thoughts about the kind of ripple effect of the Bowie exhibition? Did you see it across the Atlantic as well?
Yeah, I spent about a decade in the States, and I guess the benchmark there would be the Frida Kahlo exhibition that traveled quite considerably. And I worked at the Walker Art Center, and we always had conversations about, you know, can anyone replicate a kind of major Frida Kahlo exhibition? Because it had both the art historical resonance, but also the audiences and the numbers, and also very good for merchandise at the same time.
Well, that's a big consideration, isn't it?
It is, definitely so. And so they are artists and practitioners that can hit all those, I guess, categories. And I think as curators, we need to be open to have those conversations, because part of working in institutions is finding a way to balance the books between the shows that are our passions but are not going to make huge amounts of money or might be hugely resource intensive, and then the ones that are going to help to kind of balance things out.
It's interesting that I have noticed shows which may not have a huge number of objects and be expensive to put on, but have really engaged with audiences. And one was a V&A one, the V&A's Mary Quant exhibition. And the reason that worked, I don't know if any of you saw it, was because most of the dresses have come with personal stories. So the secretary had saved up her salary for months. So you had a story with every item, and it connected to ordinary people. And it was full of mothers and daughters like me going around looking at it. And then I saw the Fashion and Textile Museum in London has done quite a number of interesting exhibitions, the Bieber one around that, and the more recent one about Outlaws, which again had a Lee Bowery connection, but it was about the whole fashion world in the early 80s. What are your thoughts about how far the right storytelling, not necessarily expensive objects or a fancy budget, can make the difference? And have you got examples of connecting? I mean, it feels like someone you just gave an example of a connection.
Yeah, I mean, the storytelling, I think, is crucial to good curating. I mean, it's a way of drawing people in. I mean, human beings are story-led creatures. And John, you were talking about that at your talk here the other night, the importance of having a compelling story that can draw people in. And I think curating at its best is a wonderful example of that. We often traded off the connection, of course, to Barbara Hepworth at, as you'd expect, at a place called the Hepworth Wakefield, but people really did, you know, we had such a large percentage of visitors that had never previously visited a gallery or museum before. That probably makes up about 50% of our audience, and trying to find the stories that will draw them in. And once they'd realised that someone like Barbara Hepworth was from the Wakefield area, grew up in a terraced house, had a father that was working as a civil engineer connected to the mining industries, all these interesting ways in that we can consistently use to build audiences that otherwise might on occasion have felt a little bit alienated by some of the work. But the power of great storytelling, I think, is you know, one should never underestimate that. It can make or break a show.
The RA exhibition, was it last year, around the Atlantic, had some amazing work and really made something of the space it was in. What are your thoughts about the subject of the right kind of storytelling?
So I just came back from from Rotterdam, and I got to visit the Migration Museum, which is a new, spectacular institution on the kind of waterfront of Rotterdam. And actually, that's a really interesting model because they're kind of thriving off the history of migrations in the city, right? So everyone has that story to tell about their family or themselves and their kind of geographical dislocation in some way, shape, or form. But then they're connecting this to contemporary artworks. And it was a beautiful setting where you had a really amazing suitcase-based exhibition where they had really circumnavigated the globe to collect donations of suitcases from people who consider themselves migrants. And they put together this installation, and with each object, or a selection of the objects, there was a narrative from the person who gave the suitcase. And then to connect that, which was definitely about storytelling and connecting to personal histories, to the work of Yinka Shonabare, really amazing practitioners who have developed a practice with this through line. I think it was incredibly beautiful. And so there's a way to balance, a sort of very direct form of storytelling with also sophisticated artworks that deal with similar issues.
Clarrie, I've not asked you this question yet, have I?
No, I mean, I guess I would just say, just to add to everyone, I think, all of us who, are curators or, working now as a director with a curatorial team, we're looking at different entry points or different ways in to help a really wide range of audiences access work and to understand, what is essentially it's a visual argument. But I would say, we did a big show last year with Anya Galaccio, and that was kind of quite amazing. And the reason for working with someone like Anya was because we recognised she's an artist who gets invited to make projects that relate very much to a specific location. An artist who has worked a lot with apples, it made sense to invite in Kent.
The Garden of England.
Yeah, to come and do a project to make a show around that. Oh. And running alongside that, we had fantastic partnerships and a huge learning programme working with Brogdale, which is it's the Fruit Museum, which is in Faversham, through to then being able to help children understand her practice, culminating with her making a very beautiful, living artwork, which is an orchard. So I think it's all about thinking about multiple entry points, and how do you capture imagination? I mean, that's really what it's about, isn't it, when you're making shows?
Yeah.
Larry, I probably should say the smell in your gallery during that show.
Intoxicating.
Lodged in there. It was a kind of amazing experience, actually, to smell something so pungent and redolent.
Not to mention the fruit flies.
Are there exhibitions that have been unexpected hits or unexpected misses, and what have you learned from that? Do you want to go first, Daniel?
Well, unexpected misses. Certainly I think when we were both at Tate at the same time, actually, the Calder exhibition was, I think within the institution it was thought, and we've made this mistake actually at the V&A with Donatello. Alexander Calder, yeah. For us, I think, within museums and within galleries, of course it's going to be a hit. It's Alexander Calder. They're so iconic, they're stunning. And no one came. People did not connect. Once you've done lots of sculpture shows, I think you then realize that people love paintings more, flat things more than three-dimensional things, and that's just unfortunately what our audiences are right now. But that's one example. We made a mistake, I think, in what we anticipated the kind of audience appetite for Donatello would be. And I think, he's a treasure of the V&A in terms of our collection. We've got one of the strongest collections of his work anywhere in the world. And as a home of, Renaissance sculpture and Renaissance generally, it made total sense for us to do it. And there's such successes with doing Da Vinci and Raphael and Michelangelo that we thought we would be able to get that just into a three-dimensional arena. We did obviously plan that exhibition at a particular moment in time when we knew we had Chanel in the subsequent slot, so that should it need to be supported, financially.
Cross-subsidized.
Yeah, exactly.
Sense, yeah.
We planned for it to not necessarily do really well, but we hadn't planned for it to do as poorly as it did do. Yeah. But we've got many other examples. I'm thinking of the Future Starts here, which was one of the first shows we did in the Sainsbury Gallery when we reopened, and it was sort of a really weak argument and just threaded together.
What was the premise of it?
Well, I think most people who came to that would probably still be asking it at the end of the exhibition. It was taking a particular moment in time and what are mainly designers, but what are artists and designers doing to respond to a long list of particular, crises, things happening in the world right now. But it was so disparate that you just didn't really know in the end what you were supposed to take away from it. So we didn't do a good job with that at all.
Who else wants to answer on unexpected hits and misses? Simon?
The Anthony McCall show that we did maybe about a decade ago or so at the Hepworth, totally unknown name I mean, particularly in our neck of the woods in Yorkshire, but once people had experienced the show, because it was so experiential, so about engaging in, if you saw Anthony's show at Tate Modern, you know the kinds of works he produces with these sort of laser-produced, beautiful, experiential sculptures that you can kind of interact with. But it became a word-of-mouth hit, and it meant, I have to say, I've never seen an artist look so upset about how successful his show was, because the galleries were absolutely rammed, and he wanted a little more space in there. We couldn't quite control the crowds coming through, but we knew it would be popular. But once word had got out there, it was interesting that the work so chimed. It wasn't about Anthony McCall, it was about people having this incredible experience of his work in these beautiful designed David Chipperfield spaces. But it was a completely unexpected, it was an absolute smash hit for us.
Excellent. You're not going to give me a miss then?
Sorry?
You're not going to give me a miss?
A miss? Oh no, we had no misses ever at the Hepburn.
Oh, okay. Yesomi, any thoughts?
I don't have any immediate examples, but I think we're in a room of potential curatorial, the future of curatorial work. And I think this conversation is interesting because there is something specific about curatorial knowledge, even though the word curator has been expanded to the nth degree. And it's not just about an artist's historical knowledge, it is about a sensitivity to place and context, right? And to make those connections between, the canon of art history and a relevant community and connecting them. So it's really interesting to see, in some ways, if we don't take that 360 viewpoint, that's where the misses happen, right? Doesn't mean that it's not possible, it just means that you need to have a more holistic view of things.
Clarrie, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think one of the things is to be talking to the next generation. It's about this idea of risk, and I think particularly now we have to really still find ways to be brave. I think one of the projects that I did at Tate, which we really weren't sure whether to go ahead or not, was I was running a series of where we would do a winter commission on the front of the Tate Britain building, and on the Saturday where we were literally going in on the Sunday to install Shyla's installation, we knew that we were going into a second lockdown, and there was a discussion at Tate about whether we should just pull the whole thing, and I thought we shouldn't, and there was a bit of conflict of opinion around it, and worked out that we could actually install her work with all of us just literally being outside the whole time. And that's what we did. And I think what happened with Shyla's commission, for those of you, I'm not sure people did see it here, but actually what happened was it became this most amazing meeting point for people who were sitting outside on the steps of the Tate. It was a place where all of the ambulance drivers used to kind of come and stop when they were going to St Thomas's. And I sort of, it still makes me feel quite teary thinking about it, because it was something where the risk was very real. Could we do it? Should we do it? Was it appropriate or not? And the results for that it was absolutely phenomenal. All these young kids, including my teenagers who had nowhere to go, were literally sitting outside there having takeaways, because it was a kind of outdoor place where you could still, it was one of the few places where you could meet and you could look at something that was joyful and felt positive. So, but it did feel very risky.
Well, talking about risks, one of the interesting things of the last couple of years has been the way that labelling and presentation can be sometimes contentious. So a couple of examples I can think of, and they happened to both Tate Britain. One was an exhibition about the history of feminist art, which managed not to have any books by Germaine Greer on display, but had a lot of trans women artists. And I think it was the sense of exclusion rather than the inclusion that people would have noticed. And equally, there was an exhibition about the Rossettis, which had a label which told you this painting, kind of used the word, was racist. And I wonder what your thoughts are about where the balance is between labelling that reflects reality for a lot of people, and I suggest it might be partly generational, and the need not to be seen to be hectoring, because we know that not all audiences respond well to that. Simon, you look like you...
Oh, gosh, I've got this
thinking
first.
about this. Yeah.
I mean, I was always really careful with the curatorial team when they were writing text. One, we had to try and make sure that we struck a balance that was incredibly accessible for an extremely broad audience. As I said, 50-odd% of people never having been to a gallery or museum before, so you wanted to express things in a way that wouldn't be alienating for people. But I guess no one really wants to be told what to think, feel, or experience. You want to leave that space open for us to bring our own experiences to the works of art we're engaging with. And yet, there is a story, of course, to be told, particularly if a work has an art historical precedent. So I think just, writing and really taking the time to be very careful about what sort of texts do go up to make sure that people don't feel patronised, but you get the balance right. You do want to be informing people. Curatorially, you do want to be generous with sharing your knowledge. But we went through a lot of iterations of collectively trying to edit these things to get a tone of voice that felt like the Hepworth's tone of voice. And I think that really mattered, making sure there wasn't anything up there that was going to be an over-defining moment that might get in the way of what experiences very many people could have in front of a work of art. But equally, on occasion when we put labels up where there was almost nothing there at all, we got feedback that it was not generous, that we weren't helping people find ways in. So there's a thirst to want to know more, but getting the balance right, I think, was absolutely critical. Finding the right kind of editorial voice that was not patronising, but also not courting, controversy that we could well do without.
Somi, what about you? What are your thoughts on this subject?
I mean, I think it's very important. When I was at Serpentine, I oversaw the editorial team, and we definitely had a lot of conversations about how to balance accessibility, especially given, the audiences that we had at Serpentine. I think editorial can happen in different ways as well. It doesn't need to be text-based, right? You could also take an editorial view in terms of how the visitor experience is choreographed. Maybe an example of this, we worked on the Grenfell exhibition with Steve McQueen, and that was a very sensitive subject, of course. And Steve also had very clear ideas about how he wanted to present this work to an audience, but also how he wanted to hold a community through what would be a very public memorial to this very tragic event. And as part of that process, it was thinking about actually how do we steward this exhibition with a certain level of care that doesn't need to be about interpreting every single aspect of Steve's work as an artwork, because it was also about the event of Grenfell, right? So there was a certain focus of needing to be quite factually neutral in terms of the events and to kind of document those, and then to allow for a visitor experience where there was support provided. So we worked a lot with kind of trauma-informed trainers who trained our visitor services team. We had special hours for the bereaved and the families of people who experienced the fire directly, as well as more public moments as well. So I think in that way you can kind of choreograph an experience where information does not need to be overly kind of labored or overly explicit, but you can kind of guide people through it. Yeah.
Daniel, what's your take on this? I should mention there's a very interesting exhibition been on at the British Museum about art around the kind of main ancient religions of India. And a lot of the objects, they have a label which is provenance and it's factual. And a lot of this stuff was acquired by British military leaders who dug stuff up and took it home with them. And it's not judgmental, but it just gives you the story of how this stuff came to be found and preserved in the first place and ended up where it ended up. Your thoughts on that kind of element of the politics of messaging?
You can send a message on a really granular level like that, in a label, which unfortunately I think most of us also know that not a huge number of the public are necessarily reading all of those labels. And looking at it much more broadly, you are sending a much louder message and a much more significant and prominent one just by the subjects that you are choosing to put into your program. And then how you treat those, and not thinking about what you say in labels, but the avenues you choose to explore in the narrative that you've chosen for that exhibition, I think is a much more powerful way of an institution saying something about the subject that it's chosen in its program.
But you must have to say things about the objects. Think about the Mughals exhibition. I mean, a lot of that art that survived, where has it survived and how? What decisions did you make around things like that?
We, in Mughals in particular, there were obviously pieces that were, brought to the UK in the 19th century where we obviously felt comfortable with the provenance of them, of how they were acquired, of how they've been retained here, the purposes of their acquisition, and have been open about that in that particular show, which is now in Hong Kong. But we weren't looking to try and satisfy, in the same way that you shouldn't for anything you do in an exhibition, every single visitor. Because trying to have uniform satisfaction in anything that you do in an exhibition is going to lead to probably an incredibly dull experience for everyone. No one will be satisfied, and it's just not the way of doing it, basically.
Right. Clarrie, your thoughts on?
I think it's interesting. I mean, there's two examples. So at the moment, we're working with Bridget Riley, who's going to be making a show with us in November, which is quite a phenomenal thing because she's 94, and she's not sure how many more shows she wants to be really actively involved. And then the process with her, then therefore, is very much looking at, well, how do you want to tell the story of your work? And, you know, and with her, we're just going back to actually just using text that she's written. So it's just all about the process for her, about learning to look. So I think there's not one size fits everything. What was very interesting and very challenging was earlier on this year I worked on, it was a 5-year research project around resistance. So it was 100 years looking at resistance in British history, and it was such a big research project. It was very difficult to then, with, you know, the advisory team of 10 people working about how do you distill that down into how much interpretation. And actually, in the end, a lot of it we then distilled into actually very little short films, which then could really focus on particular stories that we wanted to tell that wouldn't necessarily be known. So I think there's kind of, you know, different ways, but it's you know, constantly having to kind of keep reevaluating and then learning from that and then seeing whether you want to use it for the next show.
Go ahead, Simon.
I think one thing I'd forgotten to add, I learned so much when I worked as a curator at Tate Liverpool, because we put a lot of time and effort into getting the front of house, the visitor service, experienced people that were actually in the galleries up to speed with enabling really interesting debates, discussions, arguments with the people coming through the doors. And that's something we spent a lot of time with at the Hepworth too, so actually making it a live experience of some of the debates and arguments, conversations I overheard with people that were enabled to do that because we'd spent a lot of time informing them about the work or them spending time with the artists. So I think actually the people that are directly engaging with the public coming through is a wonderful way of making sure that you open up the wider set of experiences, far more effective than any label will do.
No, completely right. I mean, Turner, I think, took on, you know, this sort of similar approach before I was there, which was, you know, the Tate Liverpool approach that Simon was talking about. And we have engagements assistants who are, you know, they do a lot of deep research into shows, and they are, you know, actively encouraged to go up and start conversations. And you're right, that's actually really where the magic starts to happen, I think, often.
Yeah. As I said at the beginning, you know, we know that the climate in the world right now is, you know, full of tension and hostility. And certainly I feel in the media in this country, as well as I think it's fair to say in some others, there can be an innate sense of looking for a story that is about woke museums and their woke shows, and using that word as an insult. What have been your observations about that climate and how much of a difference it makes to the act of putting on a show and thinking about risk? Do you want to go first, Somi?
I have a lot of colleagues in the United States, and they think about this on a daily basis. Not just whether or not they have the freedom to do the work that they've always been doing, but the sort of risk of somebody taking a strong position against a museum exhibition, and, you know, taking a very drastic act to kind of express their dissent in relation to it. So I think that, at least in the case of the United States, it's a very live question for a lot of curators. To what extent that they are tempering their work or their interpretation, I don't know. I think those are internal conversations that are probably had within the museum. But it's something that I think, you know, artists, I think one of the reasons, hopefully, why we work in this sector is because we believe in creative freedom, right? And the role of us as curators or museums is to try and safeguard that creative freedom. And it's hard when you have a context where there's a lot of volatility around freedom of speech, and how, you know, there's very subjective opinions about the sort of boundaries of that. So I think that, yeah, it's still something that's very much in a work in progress, and we wait to see what will happen kind of large institutional scales in relation to how one addresses some of these subject matter. Two things. I'm looking forward to the next documenta, because this is being developed in the context of all of these questions about freedom of speech, especially in relation to the last documenta, where there was a lot of controversy around that. And I think that they have a curator, Naomi Beckwith, who was in Chicago when I was there, who's very smart and attuned to what it means to speak about, being marginalized or certain forms of violence, especially coming from a US perspective. And how do you allow space for discussing those very deep issues while respecting, a diverse, multicultural society. So I think that's something for everyone to look out for in terms of how she takes on that, that project.
Daniel.
I think of a particular moment in time when we had Hallyu on, so a Korean sort of...
Korean Wave.
exhibition.
It was a great exhibition.
And Africa Fashion, which we tried to conceive in the same way as we did Mary Quant, with working, with a lot of people who had, family ensembles to put in it to create those stories. When we had, so I obviously don't see, all the good things that come in from visitors and all the complaints that come in from visitors, but every now and then, somehow it will, I'll get my hands on something. And there was a particular member of the public who was, had sent such an unpleasant complaint about the fact that we had Hallyu and Africa Fashion on. And his main point of complaint was really about Africa Fashion. And, it was more or less saying, what about British designers? And to me that was surprising, because if he was such a regular visitor as he said he was, he would know that we did Westwood and we'd done McQueen and all of these other British designers. But it was so negative about why we shouldn't have done this. And I remember sending that to Tristram, who's my director, and saying, job done, this is exactly what we wanted. This is not what we were looking to do. Actually, what he is angry about is the exact audience we were really trying to connect with through this program. So when we get that sort of criticism, it shows us that the changes we're wanting to make to the institution, to a really historic institution, are coming. And they won't always be easy, and it won't always be pretty, and it won't please everyone. But we're making those changes, and we're really proud of them.
The idea of broadening this sort of circle of who's covered and who's welcome, isn't it? Yeah. And some people don't like that.
They don't. But we have something for everyone.
Yeah. Clarrie.
And I would just say, sort of simply, it's about, and it's not easy to navigate, but it's trying to hold that space, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, Turner's like Serpentine, like Hepworth, were artist-led organisations, so we're non-political. But once we commit to working with an artist, we offer them the opportunity to realise whatever they want to realise, and we stand by them. And sometimes that means that there are difficult conversations to be had. Working on Resistance, landed literally. It was an amazing project, but it was, opened, I think, the week after Trump had just been elected. So there was a kind of sense around doing a show that was looking at history of resistance within the UK. It was quite...
This was back in 2016?
No, this earlier on this year.
Oh.
But having, keeping that space, really, for discussion.
Okay, Simon.
I think it's interesting in relation to, I think it's fraught when organisations take taxpayers' money. That's when it gets difficult, because we're using the taxpayers' money, which I hasten to add is never a subsidy. It is absolutely an investment. It certainly was at the Hepworth, and it certainly is at all the organisations that we've all worked in. But that is when, I guess, the media will get fraught over the kinds of agendas that are being dealt with, because it's felt the taxpayer is, they will often use the word subsidy. It isn't a subsidy, it is absolutely an investment. And boy, they get an amazing amount back on that investment. But it's fascinating in a place like the RA, which is a place that doesn't take any state money at all. It earns and fundraises all its money, and it's the world's oldest artist-led organisation. So freedom of speech is something that is massively important and powerful here. But I do think this notion of being artist-led is such a fascinating position to be in as these arguments unfold, but also where your money is coming from to enable your program. And one has to acknowledge that this is only going to get more and more fraught because of the sort of politics that are unfolding in the world at the moment now, and people worrying about where taxpayers' money is being used and whether or not we carry the argument well enough for why it is such a wonderful investment. And it's something I had to work very hard at in Wakefield, and I certainly got an awful lot of correspondence from people that felt there was perhaps, in their eyes, too much of a left-wing bias. And indeed, I got lots of complaints about showing too many female artists.
Can't have too many. Well, there's some amazing statistic, isn't there? I think the Gina Davis Institute of Media found that if you have like a crowd scene or any kind of scene with lots of people, and more than a third of the people in it are women, people tend to think there are too many women. There are more women than men, just because we're so used to seeing underrepresentation. But that's another thing. I'm about to open up to your questions, but the one thing that I wanted to finish my main question of yours was, I was thinking of, the RA did this amazing exhibition on Ukrainian art. I think it was last year. Was it last year? And I've got a poster in my wall, and I bought 2 posters, and I've got them up on my wall. And I loved that it felt so urgent and pressing, and it was telling me a story about a country that we saw on the news, and the role of curators in saving some of this art and getting it out of the country. I thought that was a wonderful example of what an exhibition can do to be cutting edge and to connect with an audience in the best possible way. So I just wanted to put that on the record. But the other main question was sponsorship, coming back to sponsorship. At a time when, as we've established, government investment is very, very hard to get in the numbers it was. So at best it's falling because of inflation. Sponsorship also feels tougher to come by, especially outside of the major institutions. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because we also know that there's all that opposition, often by artists, about who it's acceptable to take sponsorship from. So the British Museum has decided to take all that money from BP, and it'll go towards a big programme. But other institutions have said, no, they won't. What are your thoughts on this? So maybe you want to go first, Daniel.
I mean, sponsorship is, the sort of on a basic level, so significant because it obviously allows us to deliver a great deal of our program. But that sponsorship doesn't always just go into the thing, the sponsorship that they're providing something for. It goes elsewhere. It goes into operational costs. It allows us to do so many other things that we want to do as an institution. But something that is very, not often thought of enough is that when you have one of these big sponsorships, when we had Gucci sponsoring our Elton John photography collection, the amount of money that they put in to promoting their own sponsorship and therefore driving more profile for the exhibition or the project that they have supported is enormous. So there's something that they give to you as an institution, but then by partnering with certain corporates, they also then embellish the impact that project can have without you
spending their own money on the
exactly. They're activating their sponsorship to make even more of it than what they're just giving to the institution, and that's fantastic for the projects because it just brings more profile and more interest from the public, and therefore translating to more people getting excited about it and wanting to come and see it.
Okay, I'm going to give you an example, something that was some years ago at the V&A, but it was, I thought, quite controversial. There was a Pearls exhibition that was sponsored by one of the UAE.
Qatar.
Yeah, yes. And I thought that some of the labelling on it was made rather underplayed the risks and the human rights issues around pearl diving and so on. I wonder, are there regimes where you think, no, we won't take money from them now, and think about the arguments that are made about art washing?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are. When we think about our international activity, there are certainly places, that we would not be comfortable working. But that list is different today than it was 5 years ago. And that, to some extent, is down to what we see some of our, colleagues in Europe doing and what we see national governments in, other European countries doing.
Can you give an example of something that's not on the list now?
I think...
Or would is not acceptable that might have been 5 years ago?
I think there is so much activity in Saudi at the moment, and that there's a great deal of that, obviously, that's run by French government. They're supporting in all kinds of ways. It's all very, it's public. It's in every kind of arts publication that you can see. The involvement of French government in helping the cultural heritage sector in Saudi. And I think that will, for lots of institutions, mean that they are going to look at that activity differently today on the back of the Pompidou getting involved and the Louvre sending loans, etc., than they would have a number of years ago.
Yeah, Clarrie and then Simon on this sponsorship picture.
I would say that this, certainly at Tate and then also at Turner, there's ethics committees. We all spend a huge amount of time debating about appropriateness, but obviously at the end of the day, I'm running a small regional art gallery on the tip of East Kent, surrounded by kale. I would be very delighted, kale fields. I would be very delighted to have some more sponsorship conversations, because it's a pretty tough gig keeping what I'm doing open and free. So, there's that sort of sense about, I'm in a very different place, I think, from you guys, really.
Yeah, Simon.
Obviously, having relatively recently moved from the Hepworth, where I share Clarrie's, the exact same situation. Very, very tough to find corporate sponsorship outside of London, and particularly in an area as economically, socioeconomically challenged as Wakefield. Trusts and foundations was another matter entirely. But I think even towards the end of my time at the Hepworth, and as I'm discovering here, ethics committees, and then, of course, the further check of what the artists here, because this is an artist-run institution, our president leads that there are all sorts of checks and balances that are applied with ever greater scrutiny. And I guess we have to accept that the level of incisive examination over where we might take money from is higher than ever. There are all sorts of people just sitting in their bedrooms, just doing incredible levels of research into where money is coming from. So it's incumbent on us to really, really do our homework. But pragmatism also has to prevail. We have to find the money from somewhere, particularly here where that there is no state money, intentionally so, and it maybe opens up other freedoms. But of course, you want to make sure you're working with people that are absolutely in tune with what an organisation is trying to achieve. And I guess we have a lot of very strong artists to hold us to account on that front.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation. Right, we have roving microphones. If you would like to raise your hand, we should try and take questions. To try and get through as many as we can I ask people to make their questions concise and to the point? Got one in the front here, and I think, and then where else have we got hands waving? Now, we've got two microphones. I'm going to get the next microphone somewhere. We need to get a microphone to John, and then where else have we got a question? Wave your arm. We've got one over here, and then I'll come over to you. Hello. Yes, go for it.
Thank you. It may be the elephant in the room, but I use a lot of artificial intelligence apps now when I go to exhibitions around the world, whether it's here or in London or Paris or Japan or China. And of course there's Gemini, and you can walk into an exhibition and you can go through the whole exhibition in video and say to Gemini, compare this particular exhibition on Frida Kahlo to the previous 3 exhibitions and tell me what are the salient points. You can do that with every artwork. So you can use AI. Now, I would say AI is wrong about 30% of the time, but it does provide a very important thing. And you couple that with the fact that young people are using I think mobile phones should be banned from museums because they're so intrusive about taking pictures. But actually, they're using these artificial intelligence apps to develop an alternative view of the exhibition. Right. And I'd love to get people's views on where does AI, how do you think about AI? Because it's a fact of life.
Okay.
And it's very interesting in terms of information.
Yeah, well, it's certainly being used in terms of sort of data gathering, isn't it, by institutions? What are your thoughts about the role of AI? Thank you, John. I'm going to go first, Daniel. You look like you had an answer ready.
Well, no, I don't have an answer ready because I think I'm so out of touch with AI, and every time someone talks about it, I think I really have to do something about it. And maybe I should ask ChatGPT what I need to do as a crash course. So what you've described, and I don't know Gemini now, I need to go and look into it, but you describe, the kind of creation of another digital experience that you can get through this technology. And I think all of us, to a huge extent, and this doesn't mean that digital engagement isn't absolutely essential, particularly because that drives so much physical engagement into the spaces that we run. But we really kind of hang our hats on the fact that there's something meaningful about having an encounter with an artwork or an object in front of you, and that there's something to be gained from the relationships of those things that we choose to put together and the stories that they can tell by encountering them side by side. And that's obviously just in an exhibition context, but what museums and galleries also are trying to do are create spaces that are social spaces, that are civic spaces that we all feel some kind of shared ownership of, and that is another benefit of coming, that you can get one experience from something on your phone. And I mean, we were just talking about it today. I actually said to you, I said, Instagram has become a squalid place because there's just so much garbage there. And what we're trying to do in museums and galleries is to make something that is hugely differentiated from what exists elsewhere. And that's something we've been trying to do for hundreds of years.
It's so interesting that actually the physical experience is something that audiences of all generations are craving in a way. I think it's screen that is, like television and cinemas are more at risk.
And not just for the artworks. The people come here. This is one of the greatest assets of this place, of the V&A, the buildings that we have. The physical spaces that we create, whether you can play in the pond in the V&A garden and you can have a really gorgeous time having drinks with friends, those things mean something to people as well, not just the artworks.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take another question. There was one up here, and then I'm going to come to person over there next. Yes, go for your question.
Hi, I'm Simon Stevens from Museums Journal. I just wondered if the panel thought risk-taking was easier in regional galleries as opposed to sort of big, well-funded London art galleries.
Is risk-taking easier in regional galleries? What do you think, Clarrie?
Well, I guess my remit's different, and we're not ticketed, so I'm under a lot of pressure in terms of to keep the visitor figures up or to grow them in order to generate secondary spend. But actually, I do think we've got, having done such a long stint at Tate, I think there's a wonderful creative freedom I've got down in Margate. So actually, I don't regret leaving Tate and doing this instead. I do think we're able to be nimble and we expand and we contract. So I think for all of the problems it has, I've got to find a way to generate, 60% of the money I need to keep going. I like it a lot. So yes, I do think that's true.
Simon, from your experience at Hepworth, what would you say? Could you take more risks, do you think, than perhaps a bigger institution that you'd worked at could?
I think we were very fortunate having a collection that had all sorts of things that people had a long-standing relationship with. I mean, obviously Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore at the core of that collection. So there was something, for want of a better word, familiar and reassuring for people. And gradually over the years, I think the most important thing was building a relationship of trust. The audiences came to trust us when we did take risks. They went with us. I mean, when we put on our Alina Sapochnikov show, this is another one that I was surprised to find was an absolute hit for us. An artist that so few people had heard of, the subject matter looking on paper so tough and so difficult, and on probably a strange time for programming with something that had mortality at its core over Christmas, and yet it was so human, so visceral, so real, so emotionally powerful. I think we found that audiences had come to trust what we were doing, and even when they hadn't heard the artists' names, they just got a sense of, the Hepworth isn't going to shortchange us. It's going to give us something sincere, well thought through, and something they believe in. And I think audiences absolutely respond to that. They have that emotional connection.
So interesting. Yesomi.
Sorry, what was the question?
Well, it was whether actually regional smaller institutions can take more risks.
I think I mentioned earlier that I worked at a small college town in the middle of Michigan where the big event of the week was an American football game. And Eli Broad, who is a very famous and well-known art collector, was an alumni there, and he decided to give the funding to create a really spectacular contemporary art museum designed by Zaha Hadid. So it was this amazing, spaceship-like building that landed in a context where there was very few kind of relationship to contemporary art. And what I enjoyed about that the most was that as a curator, I felt less self-conscious about what I was doing. I was less, there was no one else to kind of judge me. So I could only judge myself. And obviously that was based on my relationship that I had to establish with this very, nascent audience. And also the audience, because they had different reference points, and contemporary art was not one of them, there weren't any preconceptions as to what was good art or not good art, or what an experience in an exhibition space should look like. And I think that kind of dual relationship between a willing curator and willing audiences, I found really, really kind of empowering, and lots of positive exhibitions and experiences came out of that.
Interesting. Yeah. Daniel, risk-taking.
I don't want to describe risk necessarily as just, deciding to do an exhibition which is something other than a blockbuster, because that isn't necessarily really risky. Doing an amazing show that, won't get lots of visitors isn't necessarily risky, and especially if you know that to begin with. I think there is, to a great extent, going forward with an idea and insisting that it should be an exhibition, and a major exhibition, instead of being a talk like tonight or a publication or a display, when you know that it's going to be niche, or that it won't connect with the public, or that you might curate and produce it in such a way that it's not going to connect with the public. There's an element of arrogance to that, actually, because we should be doing things that bring people together and get them in front of the ideas that we have. There's nothing, when you've curated an exhibition, there's kind of nothing worse than no one wanting to come and see it. Like, that is a devastating thing. It really hurts, to make an exhibition. You suddenly think, gosh, no one actually wants to come and visit this. But also on the flip side, it's actually incredibly risky to program something that you are convinced is going to be a huge success, and you plan your finances on, this show is going to get 400,000 people, and we're going to invest all of this money into it, and then it doesn't go well. That is catastrophic for an institution. So there's a huge amount of risk also going with the big popular ideas if they don't actually land well.
Have you ever had one not land well?
We will have. We've got to think back. Well, no, that's not, it didn't do so bad. We will have done. I'm trying to think of one that's, falls in kind of the design 21st century era. We will have done. I just can't think of one off the top of my head right now. Yeah.
I'll give an example, and I don't know, maybe it did really well, which was at Tate recently, which was about Italian sort of modern art. That a lot of it was computer-based art. It was fascinating. Oh, yeah. I thought, but I wondered what the audience for it was like, because it was a part of art that so few people would have known about. I don't know how far you still had the connections, Clarrie, at Tate Modern, to know how that one did.
I don't know the answer.
A long run
to that
as well, but I don't know if you saw it. I thought it was fascinating, and I thought that was a kind of risk-taking. But it was very, very good, and it had a lot of these original big computer art pieces. Right, let's have your question over here. Hello.
The collection.
I want to ask a question about the role of art. Benjamin once argued that the role of art has changed from oral to political. May I ask if the role of art has been changed again with the development of resources production and the change of the international situation? If not, what may be the next role of art?
It's sort of where's art going and how far the international picture has changed that. Certainly we've seen some political, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, wasn't that row about Italy and whether it would lend its art when you had the new Meloni government came in, and you suddenly had tensions opening up around art loans that were being politicised. That's one example of perhaps how art is finding itself, not through any choice, caught up in changing geopolitics. Any thoughts? I mean, have you had the impact on loans and things? Because I'm trying to think what the show was. You know the one I mean. People in the room will know. There was going to be, wasn't it a French-Italian loan to do with a big Napoleon anniversary? Was it Leonardo? But there was an issue about whether, a couple of key pieces were going to be loaned after all, and the Italian government said, well, maybe we're not going to lend them anymore. I think it was to France. We've certainly seen that happen elsewhere. It's not affected us in the UK as far as I'm aware yet, has it?
Well, there were obviously huge complications around. We had a Fabergé show on at the time that the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, and that has, for all of us, I think, Russia has been, such a sort of location of richness in art for hundreds of years, and then being pulled out of the kind of international loaning, model that exists between institutions has been very difficult. That's a significant recent example, but also, when we did our Epic Iran exhibition, and that was due to open around 2020, it was delayed with the pandemic, a year. That was built on an institutional partnership between the V&A and the National Museum of Iran, and the relations between institutions and individuals was fantastic, but it broke down because of the political situation between the nations. It didn't mean that we were not able to get incredible loans for that show, but they weren't loans that were coming out of Tehran. They were Iranian material, archaeological through to the present day, that we borrowed from a whole list of other nations. But, the public lost out because those objects in Tehran haven't left since the revolution. So the exhibition suffered as a result of it. Even though it was fantastic, it still suffered.
No, it's absolutely heartbreaking that those things can have that effect. I was trying to take a couple more questions. Have you got any more around this side? There's one over there. And is there any more over here? This might be getting to the last chance. Yes, one over there. We'll take these two. So you want to go first? If you've got the microphone to you, and then you'll have the last question after that. Hello.
Hi. I was just wondering, Daniel was talking about social and civic and how basically we can relate more the audience in the way we create exhibitions. And what's going to happen next is how is the process that you guys already have put into place will change in order to not necessarily think of how we're going to please the end audience, but how we're going to relate more to the social issues that we are discussing, where we are not going to just go and have an exhibition about Black Lives Matter just because that's the hot topic, but how we are actually going to relate with the community and even relate the artists in the process of actually immersing themselves in that reality, getting insights, what are the latent needs, the pains of that community, and then showing that through institutions that have huge visibility and that can kind of highlight that, but what processes or what needs to change in the way we create exhibitions in order for that to happen?
Great question. Who would like to take that? Especially at a time when money is tight and there's anxieties about audiences. Making art that really matters, that's changing. It's kind of part of social change in a way.
Yeah, I think you need to have institutions that are representative of their context. So what does an institution in the middle of London looks like? From the leadership level to the curatorial class to collections to visitor services. What are the narratives that we're interested in, and how is that relevant to a broad spectrum of kind of social classes or kind of ethnicities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think if we can truly build institutions in the image of the context in which they sit, then it's not going to be a conundrum to us to think about how we can remain relevant as kind of the social, political, economic landscape shifts over time.
Yeah, I'm just worrying at the moment what's happening in the US, where it feels there's a very deliberate move to dismantle a lot of that progress. Right, your question in the back row there. Hello.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just wanted to say, sorry, but sick. I really enjoyed what you were saying about it's curators' roles to be on the political pulse. And my question is, how do you as curators and directors navigate popular trends, if you will, within the art world, particularly within inclusive programming, and how do you create incredible exhibitions without becoming performative?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So how do you respond to trends and react to them? but stage exhibitions which aren't performative. So I think it comes back to what you were saying as well about, having an exhibition that's themed around a buzzword, but actually making it meaningful is a risk, isn't it? Whenever you nod, Daniel, I think, you've got an answer ready.
Well, no, I was thinking first about something you said earlier this evening, which I think is really important to stress here, particularly for anyone who is studying history of art or curating right now, is that it is not enough to just have subject specialist knowledge to be a curator. The curators of today are not just art historians, and the talent of telling stories is such a big part of it now, and which stories to tell and how to tell them. I think this is sort of related to both of the questions that we've had. It's where we are sourcing our curators and what we see as valuable experience and knowledge is now, but needs to be more, different than it has been, in the past, basically. What we see as valuable experience and knowledge, and where you get that knowledge, the source of that knowledge, not just in, secondary education, is very different. And that allows you, the cohorts that we have of curators today are made up of very different people with very different backgrounds than even 10 years ago in all of our institutions. And that means that you have different perspectives, you're talking about different things, the way in which you respond to a particular idea for a show and how you will execute it is simply different because those who are making up our institutions, thankfully, has progressed.
Any other thoughts? And it's kind of an opportunity for final thoughts, really. Simon?
Yeah, I studied at art school, and when I went to somewhere like Tate, and I was working with a lot of very formally trained art historians out of the Courtauld, and we do studio visits together, I realised that so much of my engagement with what artists was doing was about the made physical thing, and I rather admired the fact that these Courtauld trained art historians had this other way of going at it and trying to find the way in which these things could be melded. But for me, I feel like I've never had a great idea for our programme anywhere I've worked without really deep conversations with artists. And that's one of the reasons I was so eager to come here, because it's an artist-led institution. I had my first exhibitions committee yesterday with lots of fascinating artists with extremely strong opinions about the upcoming programme. And the debate was fantastic. People really going in depth. So I think trying to privilege the artist's voice in all of this and being a good conversational partner for artists, I think, is one of the things that curators really need to concentrate on, and thinking about what it is to make a work of art.
Yesomi, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, so in December, I had the pleasure of meeting the director of the Kahanenko Museum in Kiev. And she had a question for me. I was giving a talk in a conference in LA, and she was interested because they have a collection of West African contemporary art, and she was interested in having some expertise to help them think about displaying this work. And my question to her was, how are you still working in the context of wartime? How are you doing this? And she just spoke very much about her sense of conviction about the need for cultural institutions to remain active and not to kind of go silent and go dormant, because they are the place where the culture is going to thrive regardless of the violence of the war. But that's going to make sure that people stay together, right? And there's going to make sure that Ukrainian culture continues into the future. And I was really touched by that, to the point that I connected her to colleagues over here. And I think there's something there about, let's not wait until the moment of complete uncertainty and risk and violence to kind of be steadfast in our convictions, right? And she reminded me of that, actually, that even if you're working in an institution in a seemingly peaceful country with kind of neutral politics, there's still work to be done. There's still kind of narratives to be supported, and there's still kind of this project of greater inclusion and greater representation to happen within the spaces of museums. So I think that's just something for you to take away, hopefully.
Beautifully put. Clarrie, any final thoughts from you?
I'm just thinking an awful lot about our civic responsibility. What it means to be. We are the main thing in Margate. I mean, there's Dreamland, obviously, but and the role that we play within the community and how we support them. And I think that that's constantly evolving. But I think it's true of a lot of institutions are doing a lot of thinking and soul searching around that. And that's actually part of what makes the job so special, if I'm honest about it. But it's like we're a young institution. We're constantly thinking about how we could do things different and better and stay relevant.
Well, it's been so lovely to have the benefit of hearing about so much collective experience on this panel, and how much enthusiasm you still have for what you do. And I very much wish you all the very best for those of you who are embarking on careers in the curatorial museum world. I wanted to hand over now to John for some final words. And thank you to our panel, I think.
Just on time.
Yeah, she's good, isn't she?
Thank you. And
It's very delicate.
I don't really want to stand with my back to you. That's terribly rude. It's very kind of you to give me the last word. As I listened to this impressive panel tonight, it took me back to our original concept of why we engaged with the Royal Academy and Rebecca and her colleagues on creating a curatorial project. Because it is, in the context of the creative industries today, increasingly one of the most complex things to navigate, to learn. And I think it's very clear from this discussion, because of what's happening in the sort of globalization, terrible word, but true, the globalization of art, the role of technology, this great pressure on space. We didn't talk today really about curating exhibitions outside of museums, like at David Tromley's house or at Castle Howard, but there's the same challenges at curating or what Anthony Gormley does across the world in a number of big cities. But the whole idea of space, people want to be involved themselves in terms of personal engagement. We saw that with the Yoko Ono exhibition at the Tate, which I was happy to sponsor. And then the great demands, I think the role model of curators in the program is very important. So the ability of these young curators to learn from role models is important. And I originally learned this with respect to directors of a play from Stephen Daldry and David Land, that they basically said, you can't really teach certain things. You have to just navigate the creative process by watching very talented people do it. And we've had this great display of talent today. But I think being a curator today is probably more difficult and more challenging because the amount of effort you have to put in, not just to the research, but to think about your different stakeholders and then ultimately what you're trying to do. It's really a very challenging period. So I think when I look ahead and you think about the changes in technology and the role of technology, and with my Getty hat on, I'm on the board of the Getty, we've taken a very strong public view that it's morally and culturally unethical to store art. All art should be on view and should not be stored. It should be visible to everyone in the world at any point in time. So museums that store material parts of their collection indefinitely because the director or the curators decide it's not worth showing, there probably are people in the world who do want to see it or who should see it, or who might get something out of it. So the ownership of art, in terms of the sharing of art and the community space of art appreciation, I think that's going to change. One of the things we did at the Getty was we bought the OMI jointly with the National Portrait Gallery here in London. It's going to be shared equally 3 years, 3 years, 5 years, 5 years, 10 years, 10 years, indefinitely. That's going to happen more and more. And I think that type of opportunity with the internationalization of art and collections coupled with technology, it's really going to put more and more onus, and I think great opportunity and challenge and responsibility on the role of the curator. So I applaud you all for this panel. I thank the Royal Academy for this wonderful partnership, and we look forward to continuing it, and thank you all for your engagement in this panel.